He bit 3 men, but never once made a sound when they heard him. The sign on the steel gate read in bold red letters, "Do not enter," and beneath it, smaller, colder, "Termination approved," as if the decision had already been made somewhere far away from the smell of disinfectant and damp concrete that clung to the air inside the shelter. The German shepherd stood in the far corner of the enclosure, motionless, his coat a mix of dark sable and dust, his ribs faintly visible beneath fur that had long lost its shine, his amber eyes fixed not on the people who passed, but somewhere beyond them, as if he had already learned that nothing coming through that door was meant to stay. He did not bark when footsteps echoed down the corridor, did not flinch when keys rattled or when voices rose in cautious warning, and that silence unsettled everyone more than any growl ever could, because it felt less like anger and more like something broken too deep to reach. A clipboard hung outside his kennel with notes written in tight, hurried handwriting, words like unpredictable and untamable underlined twice. But there was one line that no one could quite explain, a line that read simply, "Responds to presence, not command," though no one stayed long enough to understand what that meant. Down the hall, fluorescent lights hummed softly, flickering just enough to cast long, uncertain shadows across the floor, and somewhere a metal door shut with a hollow clang that echoed like a final answer. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched low across the parking lot, warming the windshields of parked trucks, but none of that light reached inside, not past the narrow windows set too high for anything to see out of. Then the door opened again, slower this time, and a man stepped in, his boots heavy but measured, each step deliberate, as if he had learned long ago that rushing into anything only made it worse. His name was Daniel Hayes, though no one here knew him yet, and he carried himself with the quiet stillness of someone who had seen more than he ever spoke about, shoulders squared out of habit, eyes scanning not for threat, but for meaning. He paused just inside the doorway, letting the sound settle, letting the space breathe, as if he understood that places like this had their own kind of silence, one that couldn't be broken, only entered. A staff member approached him, voice low, explaining the situation, the risks, the timeline, the inevitability that had already been written into the paperwork. But Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't react in any way that would suggest agreement or doubt. He simply listened, the way he used to listen to things that couldn't be explained in words. When the man finally gestured toward the end of the corridor, toward the kennel no one else wanted to stand near, Daniel's gaze followed, steady and unblinking, until it landed on the dog. For a moment, nothing happened. No movement, no sound, just two living beings existing in the same space without demand or expectation. The dog did not bare his teeth. Daniel did not call out. There was only the faint hum of the lights above and the distant rhythm of something dripping, slow and steady, like time itself refusing to stop. Then Daniel took a step forward, and something shifted, not in the room, not in the air, but in the space between them, something almost invisible, like a thread pulled taut after being left untouched for too long. The staff member behind him spoke again, a warning this time, sharper, more urgent, but Daniel raised a hand just slightly, not to silence, but to pause, as if even the words might disturb whatever fragile balance had begun to form. He moved closer to the kennel, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see the fine tremor in the dog's breath, the way his ears twitched at the smallest sound, the way his eyes, though tired, were still searching, not for danger, but for something he had not yet decided to believe in. Daniel didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, present, steady, unarmed in every way that mattered. And for the first time since anyone could remember, the dog shifted his weight, just slightly, as if considering the possibility that this moment might not end the way all the others had. The corridor seemed to stretch longer the closer Daniel moved, each step measured in quiet inches rather than feet, his boots making a soft, deliberate contact against the concrete floor as if he were careful not to disturb something fragile that no one else could see. And behind him the staff members shifted uneasily, arms folded, watching with the kind of tension that came from witnessing too many attempts in the same way. But Daniel did not look back, because the moment he stepped into that line of sight, into that narrow field where the dog's gaze had been fixed, everything else fell away. The noise, the warnings, even the faint hum of the overhead lights. And what remained was the steady rhythm of two breaths learning each other from a distance. Rex did not move at first, his body still angled toward the corner as if retreat had once been his only option. But his eyes tracked every inch of Daniel's approach, not with aggression, not even with fear, but with a kind of guarded calculation, as though he had learned that every human came with a cost, and he was measuring whether this one would be any different. Daniel stopped just outside the reach of the kennel bars, close enough to see the fine details most people missed, the slight tension in the dog's jaw, the way one ear held a fraction lower than the other, the faint rise and fall of his chest that spoke not of calm, but of control, the kind of control that came from surviving too many moments where panic would have made things worse. He did not reach for the latch. He did not crouch or call out in a soft voice the way others had tried. Instead, he let his arms hang loose at his sides, palms open, shoulders relaxed, offering nothing but presence, the same way he had once been taught to stand in situations where reacting too quickly could break something that could not be repaired. Time stretched thin between them, seconds folding into something heavier, and somewhere down the hall a phone rang, distant and irrelevant, swallowed by the stillness that held this space together. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rex shifted his weight forward, one paw moving a few inches across the concrete, the sound so faint it could have been imagined. But Daniel noticed, his eyes softening just enough to acknowledge the movement without pushing it further. The staff member exhaled behind him, a quiet breath of disbelief, but said nothing, as if even that might tip the balance back into something familiar and final. Daniel lowered himself then, not all the way, just enough to bring his center closer to the dog's line of sight, knees bending slightly, posture steady, his gaze never locking too hard, never demanding, only inviting in a way that could be refused without consequence. Rex's ears twitched again, and for a moment his body tensed, a memory flickering beneath the surface, something that had taught him that proximity meant pressure, that hands meant control, that closeness always came with an expectation he could not meet, and his muscles held that memory like a warning. But Daniel did not move to close the distance, did not offer a command or a sound that would force a decision. He simply remained, breathing slow, grounded, as if anchoring the space itself. A full minute passed, then another, the kind of time most people would have already abandoned. But Daniel had learned patience in places where it was the only thing that kept people alive, and he let that patience settle into the moment until it felt less like waiting and more like understanding. Then Rex took another step, small, uncertain, but deliberate, his nose lifting slightly, as if catching something unfamiliar, not a scent exactly, but the absence of one, the absence of urgency, of expectation, of that sharp edge that usually followed humans into his space. He paused again, closer now, the distance between them no longer measured in feet but in trust, and Daniel felt it, that fragile thread tightening just a little more, not something he could see, but something he recognized all the same. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stayed exactly where he was, because sometimes the most important thing a man could do was not move at all. The distance between them no longer felt like a barrier but a question waiting to be answered, and Daniel understood that questions like this were never solved by force, only by time, by presence, by the quiet offering of something that could not be taken back once given. And so he remained exactly where he was, breathing slow, steady, allowing the rhythm of his body to speak in a language that did not rely on words. Rex stood there, closer now than before, his nose lifting slightly as he tested the air again, searching for the familiar signals he had learned to trust, tension, command, expectation, but none of it was there, only the faint scent of worn cotton, leather, and something else beneath it, something older, something that carried the weight of places far from this narrow corridor, places where silence had also meant survival. His ears shifted, catching the subtle sound of Daniel's breath, in and out, unhurried, and for a moment the dog's posture softened by a fraction, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to mark a change that had not happened in a long time. Daniel lowered himself a little more, careful, deliberate, stopping halfway as if to ask permission without speaking, his knees bending until he was closer to the ground, not towering, not imposing, just present in a way that made space rather than taking it. His hands remained open, resting loosely against his thighs, fingers relaxed, showing nothing hidden, nothing held back, and his gaze drifted slightly to the side, not challenging, not avoiding, simply allowing the dog to choose how much to see. The shelter seemed to hold its breath around them, the usual sounds fading into the background, even the faint buzz of the lights above feeling distant, as if this small space had been set apart from everything else. Rex took another step forward, then stopped, his body still carrying the memory of hesitation, of moments where moving closer had led to something he could not control, and that memory lingered in the tightness of his muscles, in the careful way he placed each paw. But there was something else now, something quieter, something that had not been there before, curiosity, fragile and uncertain, but real. Daniel felt it the way he had once felt changes in the field, subtle shifts in the air that signaled something turning before it could be seen, and he did not rush it, did not lean in or reach out. He simply stayed, grounded in that moment, letting the dog come to the edge of his own decision. A memory flickered behind Daniel's eyes, uninvited but familiar, a different place, a different kind of silence, where waiting had been the difference between holding on and losing something that could never be replaced, and for a brief second his breath caught, just slightly, but he let it pass, returning to the steady rhythm he had built, because this moment was not about him, not entirely. It was about what could exist between two beings if neither one tried to. Take control. Rex's nose lowered now, just a few inches, drawing in the space between them, and his body leaned forward, not fully, not yet, but enough to close the distance to something that could no longer be measured in steps. His eyes, once fixed somewhere far away, were now focused on Daniel, searching, not for threat, but for truth, for consistency, for something that would not shift the moment he moved closer. Daniel did the only thing he knew to do. He stayed exactly the same, unchanged, unshaken, offering no sudden movement, no hidden intent, only the quiet assurance of someone who was not going to force the outcome. Seconds stretched again, but this time they carried a different weight, not tension, but possibility, and in that narrow space, something began to loosen, not all at once, not in any way that could be seen clearly, but in the smallest of ways, the slight lowering of Rex's head, the softening of his stance, the way his breath no longer came in controlled, measured pulls, but in something closer to natural. Then, slowly, as if testing the very idea of it, Rex extended his neck forward, just enough for his nose to hover near Daniel's hand, not touching, not committing, just close enough to feel the warmth there, and Daniel did not move. Not even a fraction, because he knew that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the dog, to the choice being made in silence. The air between them felt different now, less like a barrier and more like a bridge, fragile, unfinished, but real, and for the first time since anyone could remember, Rex did not look past the human in front of him. He looked at him, fully, as if seeing something he had not been able to recognize before, something that did not demand, did not take, did not break, something that simply remained. The space between his hand and the dog's nose held steady, suspended in a kind of quiet that felt almost sacred, and Daniel could feel the weight of it, not as pressure, but as something fragile, something that could vanish the moment he tried to claim it. So he did not move, not even when the warmth of Rex's breath brushed faintly against his skin, not even when every instinct in him, every trained reflex, whispered to reach out and complete the moment, because he knew better than that, knew that trust was not something you took, it was something that came forward on its own, or not at all. Rex hesitated there, his nose hovering just inches away, the faint tremor in his breath still present but softer now, less controlled, more natural, as if something inside him had begun to loosen its grip, and for a brief second, the tension that had defined his entire posture seemed to waver, not disappear, but shift, making room for something else to exist alongside it. His eyes flicked up, meeting Daniel's for a heartbeat, searching, measuring, waiting for the familiar turn, the moment where stillness became command, where presence became pressure, but it did not come, and that absence spoke louder than anything else could have. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rex closed the remaining distance, his nose brushing against the back of Daniel's hand in the lightest contact, so faint it could have been imagined, and then he paused again, holding there, as if unsure whether the world would change because of it. Daniel felt it, that small, fragile touch, and something in his chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because he had known moments like this before, moments where everything balanced on something so small it could not be explained, and he kept his hand exactly where it was, steady, open, allowing the contact to exist without asking for more. The dog's nose lingered for another second, then another, drawing in the scent, the warmth, the absence of threat, and his posture shifted again, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his stance no longer braced for impact, but held in something closer to uncertainty, the kind that precedes change. A faint sound escaped him then, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, something that felt more like a question than a warning, and Daniel heard it, understood it without needing to translate, because he had once carried that same sound in his own silence. He turned his hand slowly, carefully, so that his palm faced upward, a motion so gradual it barely disturbed the air, and then he stopped, leaving the space open, offering without insisting. Rex watched the movement closely, every muscle ready to react, but when nothing followed, when the hand remained open and still, he lowered his head a fraction more, his nose brushing into the center of Daniel's palm, the contact deeper now, more certain, though still cautious, as if he was testing whether this new version of the world could hold. Time stretched again, but it no longer felt heavy, it felt quiet, almost gentle, and somewhere behind them the staff member shifted, a soft intake of breath breaking through the stillness, but neither Daniel nor Rex reacted, both held within a moment that no longer belonged to the room around them. Daniel's fingers moved then, just slightly, a small, careful motion, resting against the side of Rex's muzzle, not gripping, not controlling, just touching, and for a fraction of a second the dog's body tensed, a reflex, a memory, but it did not escalate, it did not turn into retreat, instead it softened again, the tension passing through him like a wave that had nowhere left to go. Rex did not pull away. He did not step back. He remained there, his head lowered into the open palm, his breathing steadying into something that no longer needed to be managed, and in that stillness, something deeper shifted, something that had been locked away long before this room, long before this day. Daniel exhaled slowly, the first breath that carried something more than control, something that felt like release, and he let it pass without sound, without words, because words would have been too much, too loud for what was happening here. The light above flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft, even glow across the concrete floor, and for the first time since he had entered the building, the space no longer felt cold, no longer felt like a place where endings were decided, but something else entirely, something unfinished, something that had just begun. Rex shifted his weight again, not away this time, but closer, his body angling slightly toward Daniel, the distance between them gone in any way that mattered, and though nothing dramatic had happened, no sudden movement, no visible change that could be written down or explained, the truth of it settled quietly into the room, undeniable in its simplicity. The dog who had been marked unreachable had chosen, in the smallest way possible, to stay. The contact did not break, and that was where everything changed, not in a sudden way, not in anything that could be seen from across the room, but in the quiet decision of a dog who had always stepped away choosing, for the first time, not to, and Daniel understood the weight of that choice even as he kept his hand steady, his fingers resting lightly against the warm line of Rex's muzzle, careful not to turn the moment into something it was not ready to become. The dog's breathing settled further, the shallow tension giving way to something deeper, more natural, and his eyes, once scanning for an exit, now lingered, focused, present in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to escape the moment, but to understand it. Daniel shifted slightly, just enough to ease the strain in his knees, but he did it slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements within the rhythm they had already built together, and Rex watched, ears tilting, body alert, but not alarmed, tracking the motion without retreating. The staff member behind them took a cautious step closer, drawn in by what he was seeing, but stopped again, as if recognizing that whatever was happening here did not belong to anyone else. A soft clink of metal echoed faintly from somewhere down the corridor, and for a brief second Rex's head lifted, his muscles tightening in reflex, But Daniel did not pull away, did not react to the shift, and after a moment the tension passed, the dog's focus returning, his nose pressing slightly more into Daniel's palm, as if grounding himself there. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but it carried the weight of a decision that had not been made in a long time. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and this time he let his fingers move just a fraction more, tracing lightly along the edge of Rex's jaw, not holding, not guiding, simply acknowledging that the space between them had changed. The dog did not flinch. Instead, he leaned, just slightly, into the touch, and that subtle shift spoke louder than any sound could have, a quiet admission that something inside him was beginning to loosen, to trust in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Daniel lowered himself the rest of the way to one knee, bringing himself fully into the dog's level, his posture grounded, balanced, and he waited again, because he knew that progress like this was not measured in steps, but in moments, in the space where nothing was forced and everything was chosen. Rex took a slow step forward, closing the last of the distance between them, his body no longer angled toward the corner, but toward Daniel, his weight centered, his stance no longer defensive but uncertain in a different way, as if he was learning something new and did not yet know what to call it. The air in the room felt warmer now, not in temperature but in tone, as if the sharp edges that had once defined the space had softened into something that allowed breathing room. Daniel reached for nothing, asked for nothing, and that absence became the very thing that held the moment together. Rex's tail, which had remained still for as long as anyone could remember, gave the slightest movement, not a wag, not yet, just a small shift, as if testing whether such a thing was still possible. Daniel noticed, but he did not react, did not break the stillness with praise or excitement, because he understood that even that could be too much, could turn something fragile into something fragile in a different way. Instead, he stayed quiet, letting the moment belong entirely to the dog. A full minute passed, then another, and the world outside the kennel seemed to resume its distant rhythm, voices murmuring, doors opening and closing. But inside this space, time moved differently, measured not in seconds, but in trust slowly taking shape. Daniel's hand remained where it was, steady and warm, and Rex remained with him, no longer hovering at the edge, but standing fully within reach, his presence no longer guarded by distance. The staff member behind them finally spoke, his voice low, almost reverent, as if he were afraid to disturb what he was witnessing. But Daniel did not turn, did not answer, because there was nothing to say that would not break the quiet language unfolding between them. Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Daniel's again, and this time there was something different in them, not the distant look of a dog waiting for the moment to end, but something closer to recognition, as if he was beginning to see not just a human, but this human, someone who had not taken, had not forced, had simply stayed. Daniel held that gaze for a brief moment, then softened it, letting it drift just enough to remove any pressure, and in that subtle exchange, something settled between them, not a command, not a bond fully formed, but the beginning of one, quiet, steady, and real, built not on control, but on the simple, powerful act of remaining. The stillness between them held, but something deeper began to move beneath it, something Daniel recognized not with his eyes, but with a part of him that had been shaped long before this room, long before this moment, a place where silence had once meant survival and trust had always come at a cost. And as Rex stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer retreating, Daniel felt that same quiet tension rise inside his own chest, not from fear of the dog, but from memory. He did not pull his hand away, but his fingers stilled, resting against the side of Rex's muzzle as his gaze drifted for a brief second, unfocused, caught between the present and something older, something that had never fully left. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights sharpened. The distant echo of boots on concrete somewhere down the hall seemed louder than before, and for a moment, the rhythm he had built began to falter, just slightly, just enough for the change to exist. Rex felt it. The dog's ears shifted immediately, his body responding not to a visible threat, but to something more subtle, a change in the energy of the man in front of him, the steadiness that had anchored the moment wavering just enough to be noticed. His muscles tightened again, not fully, not as before, but enough to bring a flicker of hesitation back into his stance, and he drew his head back a fraction of an inch, the contact breaking, the fragile thread between them stretching thin. Daniel noticed it instantly, the absence of warmth in his palm, the slight distance that had not been there seconds ago, and he exhaled slowly, grounding himself again, pulling his focus back from where it had drifted, because he understood that this moment was not only about the dog learning to trust, it was about him holding that space without letting his own past fracture it. He lowered his gaze slightly, softening it again, letting the tension leave his shoulders, letting his breath return to that steady, quiet rhythm, not forcing it, just allowing it to settle the way it had before. Rex watched closely, his eyes, sharp, measuring, waiting for the shift to continue, for the familiar pattern to complete itself, but it did not. Instead, Daniel remained, still, present, unchanged once more, and slowly, the tension in Rex's body eased again, the tightness in his muscles loosening as the moment rebalanced itself. The distance between them remained small, but it was there now, a few inches where before there had been none, and Daniel did not try to close it, did not reach forward to reclaim what had been lost, because he knew that doing so would only confirm the very thing the dog feared. Instead, he let the space exist, let it breathe, trusting that if it was meant to close again, it would not be by his hand. Seconds passed, quiet and uncertain, and then Rex took a step forward again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if testing whether the ground beneath him would hold, his nose lowering once more toward Daniel's open hand, pausing just short of contact, waiting, not for permission, but for consistency. Daniel did not move. He did not shift. He did not try to encourage or call the dog closer. He simply remained exactly as he was, offering the same presence, the same stillness, the same absence of pressure that had allowed the first connection to form. And then, gently, Rex closed the distance again, his nose pressing into Daniel's palm with a little more certainty than before, as if confirming something that had nearly been lost but had held. Daniel's fingers moved again, slow and careful, resting once more along the side of Rex's jaw. And this time, when the contact returned, it carried a different weight, not just curiosity, but the beginning of trust that had been tested and had not broken. The dog's breathing steadied again, deeper now, less guarded, and his body leaned just slightly into the touch, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that something inside him had shifted beyond the first fragile step. Daniel felt it, and he allowed himself one small movement, a subtle nod of his head, not directed at anyone, not even at the dog, but at the moment itself, an acknowledgement that this was not about control, not about fixing something broken in a single instant, but about staying, about returning, about proving through action that not everything disappears the moment it is tested. Behind them, the staff members stood in silence, no longer uncertain, no longer skeptical, but watching with a kind of quiet respect, as if witnessing something that could not be taught, something that could only be understood by those who had lived through their own versions of distance and return. Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Daniel's once more, and this time there was no flicker of retreat, no searching for an exit, only a steady gaze that held for a second longer than before, and in that extra second, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be announced. The space between them was no longer fragile in the same way. It had been tested, stretched, and had held, and that, more than anything else, changed what came next. The moment settled into something quieter, something steadier, and for the first time since Daniel had stepped into the corridor, it no longer felt like he was approaching an ending, but standing at the edge of a beginning that neither of them fully understood yet. And he stayed there, grounded on one knee, his hand still resting gently along the side of Rex's jaw, not holding, not guiding, simply present in a way that did not ask for anything in return. Rex remained close, closer than he had allowed anyone before, his body angled toward Daniel now, no longer pulled back toward the corner, no longer divided between staying and leaving, and his breathing carried a new rhythm, one that no longer sounded like it was being controlled, but allowed. The faint tension that had once lived in every line of his posture had softened into something else, something quieter, something that made space instead of closing it. Daniel shifted slightly, just enough to ease his balance, and this time Rex did not pull away, did not retreat at the movement. his ears flicking once in awareness, but settling again almost immediately, as if he had begun to understand that movement did not always lead to change. The man's hand lowered slowly, giving Rex the space to decide again, not assuming the contact would remain, not claiming it as something secured, and for a brief second the distance returned, small, but noticeable, a pause in the connection that allowed the next step to be chosen freely. Rex watched the hand as it moved away, his gaze following, and then, after a moment that stretched just long enough to matter, he stepped forward on his own, closing that space again without hesitation, his head lowering into the open palm, as if the choice had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. Daniel felt it, that quiet return, and this time he allowed his fingers to move just slightly more, a soft, careful motion along the side of Rex's neck, not a command, not a claim, just a continuation of what had already begun. The dog's body responded with a subtle shift, his weight leaning a fraction closer, not fully, not all at once, but enough to show that something inside him had crossed a line it had once refused to approach. A faint sound escaped Rex again, softer than before, almost like a breath shaped into something more, and Daniel's expression changed by the smallest degree, not a smile, not yet, but something warmer, something that had not been there when he first walked in. The shelter around them seemed distant now, the walls, the sounds, the presence of others fading into the background as the space between them took on its own quiet gravity. Daniel slowly moved his other hand, not reaching forward, but resting it lightly against his knee, keeping his posture open, balanced, unthreatening, and Rex responded by stepping closer still, his shoulder now within inches of Daniel's chest, his presence no longer cautious in the same way, but still careful, still aware, still learning. The dog's tail moved again, this time not just a slight shift, but a small, uncertain motion, low and slow, as if testing whether it was allowed, and Daniel noticed it without reacting, without breaking the moment, because he understood that even recognition could be too much, could turn something genuine into something performed. Instead, he remained steady, letting the dog exist exactly as he was becoming. Another second passed, then another, and Rex did something no one in that building had ever seen before. He leaned fully into the space between them, not pressing, not collapsing, but allowing his weight to rest, even if just slightly, against the man who had not asked him to. Daniel did not tighten his grip, did not pull him closer. He simply stayed, letting the contact remain as it was given, and in that stillness, something settled into place, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Behind them, the staff member lowered his arms, the tension leaving his stance as he watched in quiet disbelief. But even that did not reach into the space that Daniel and Rex now shared, a space built not from force or control, but from something far simpler, far rarer, the decision, made in silence, to stay. The weight of the moment did not rise. It settled, deeper and quieter, like something finding its place after being lost for too long, and Daniel remained exactly where he was, one knee on the cold concrete, his hand resting gently along Rex's neck, not holding, not guiding, just there, steady and real, while the dog leaned into that space, as if discovering something he had never been allowed to keep before. The air felt different now, not lighter, not warmer, but calmer, as if the sharp edges that once defined the room had softened into something that could finally be held without breaking. Rex's breathing had changed completely, no longer measured or guarded, but slow and even, each breath rising and falling with a quiet rhythm that matched Daniel's own, and for a moment it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Daniel lowered his head slightly, not to look away, but to ease the space between their eyes, understanding that sometimes even a gaze could carry too much weight, and Rex responded in kind, his posture loosening further, his body no longer braced for something to go wrong. A faint sound came from him again, softer than before, almost like a sigh, and Daniel felt it more than he heard it, a release that did not need to be explained. Slowly, carefully, Daniel shifted his hand, letting it slide just a little farther along Rex's shoulder, testing not the dog, but the moment itself, and when Rex did not pull away, did not tense, did not retreat, Daniel allowed the movement to complete, his palm resting lightly against the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath it. It was a simple thing, a small thing, but it carried a meaning that could not be measured in words. Rex stood there, fully within reach now, his body no longer divided between staying and leaving, his presence grounded in a way that had not existed before, and after a few seconds, he did something even quieter, something that no one would have noticed if they were not looking closely. He closed his eyes, just briefly, just enough to let go of the need to watch, to guard, to anticipate. Daniel saw it, and he did not react, did not speak, did not break the stillness with anything unnecessary, because he understood what that meant, understood the kind of trust it took to close your eyes in front of someone when you had learned not to. The shelter beyond them continued as it always had, distant voices, the faint echo of movement, the world carrying on without noticing what had changed in this small corner of it. But inside the kennel, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Daniel slowly straightened just a little, not standing, not leaving, but adjusting enough to signal something new, and Rex lifted his head, his eyes opening again, not with alarm, but with awareness, tracking the movement without fear. For a brief second, they held that space again, looking at each other without pressure, without expectation, and then Daniel did something small, something almost unnoticeable. He turned his body slightly toward the open gate, not pulling, not calling, just creating a direction, a possibility. Rex's ears flicked, his gaze shifting toward the opening, then back to Daniel, as if weighing something that had never been offered to him before, and after a moment, he took a single step in that direction, then stopped, looking again, waiting. Daniel did not move further, did not urge him on. He simply remained, offering the same steady presence, and after a second that felt longer than it should have, Rex stepped forward again, crossing the threshold not because he was told to, not because he was forced, but because he chose to, and in that quiet, unspoken decision, everything that had come before found its meaning. The step beyond the threshold was small, almost unremarkable to anyone who might have glanced down the corridor, but inside that moment it carried the weight of something far greater, something that could not be undone, and Daniel did not follow immediately. He did not reach for Rex or guide him forward. He simply remained where he was for one more second, allowing the choice to stand on its own, unclaimed, unforced, real. Rex paused just outside the kennel, his body still, his ears shifting as he took in the unfamiliar space, the open corridor, the distant sounds that had once meant uncertainty, but now felt different, not safe, not yet, but not threatening in the same way either. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Daniel, not with hesitation, but with something quieter, something that felt like a question that no longer needed words. Daniel met that look with the same steady calm he had held from the beginning, his posture relaxed, his gaze soft, offering nothing new, nothing that would change the balance they had built, and after a moment, he rose slowly to his feet, not towering, not imposing, just standing, as if to say that whatever came next would happen together, not one ahead of the other. The space between them shifted again as Daniel took a single step forward, not closing the distance completely, but aligning himself beside Rex rather than in front of him, and that small change altered everything. No longer a path to follow, but a presence to walk with. Rex watched the movement, his body alert for a brief second, then settling as the familiar rhythm returned, and without hesitation, he stepped forward again, this time matching Daniel's pace, not guided, not pulled, simply choosing to move in the same direction. The corridor seemed different now, wider, quieter, as if the walls themselves had eased, and the staff member who had stood watching lowered his gaze slightly, not out of disbelief anymore, but out of respect for something he understood he had just witnessed. Daniel did not speak, not to the dog, not to the man behind him, because there was nothing that needed to be said, nothing that words could add without taking something away. Rex stayed close, not pressed against him, not dependent, but aware, his steps measured but steady, his presence no longer divided. And as they reached the end of the corridor, where the door opened to the outside light, he hesitated for just a moment, the brightness spilling across the floor in a way that felt unfamiliar. Daniel stopped as well, not turning, not urging, simply waiting, and after a second, Rex stepped forward into the light, his body adjusting to the warmth, his eyes narrowing slightly before settling. And when he looked back again, it was not to check for danger, but to confirm something else, something that had already been decided. Daniel stepped out beside him, the cool air carrying a faint scent of grass and distant traffic, and for a brief moment, both of them stood there, not moving, not rushing into what came next, just existing in a space that no longer felt confined. Rex's tail moved again, a little more certain this time, low and steady, and Daniel noticed it without reaction, the same way he had noticed everything else, quietly, without claiming it. A truck passed somewhere beyond the lot, its sound fading into the distance, and Rex's ears flicked toward it before settling again, his attention returning not to the noise, but to the man beside him. Daniel glanced down briefly, just a fraction, his eyes soft, and though he said nothing, the silence between them carried something that did not need to be spoken. Rex shifted closer, just slightly, aligning himself with Daniel's side, not because he had been told to, but because he had chosen to remain there. And in that quiet alignment, something complete took shape, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable in its simplicity. The door behind them remained open, the sign still hanging where it had always been, but it no longer meant what it had before, and as Daniel took his next step forward, Rex moved with him, not following, not being led, but walking beside him, steady and certain, as if he had finally found something worth staying for.